Um, could you describe some examples and sources of environmental racism in your district and say how they have affected OUSD students, parents, and educators? And what commitments can you make toward combating the disproportionate impacts of pollutant exposure on OUSD students, parents, and educators?
That's a loaded question. Okay. Growing up in Oakland, wow. I mean, we can go in history on this one. Oakland has been a unique fabric in its community, the fact that we intertwine so many diversity within the city. Every neighborhood it forms a patch of what makes Oakland unique, whether it's Latinos, whether it's African Americans, whether it's Asians, whether it's Pacific Islanders, you name it. Oakland's unique because we pride ourselves in the fact that we are that patchwork of diversity. But even though we're diverse, there's always been animosity between groups of people because in a historical sense, we've seen how one group has struggled in order to achieve a certain leadership, and it feels threatened when another group comes along. And we've seen that. Especially, I mean, if growing up, I mean, one of the biggest issues why charter schools got introduced to Oakland was because when I was in Lazier, in the Fruitville district, which is a heavily Latino community, they felt that the school district wasn't providing the necessary support for bilingual students who were second generation English learners. And so they felt that they had to create their own school environment to provide that support to their students because they felt like they weren't being given the support or the attention from the school district. And that's when Jewtown Charter School got developed back then in 1994 to 1995 and so forth. And it was a grassroots movement. A lot of communities started looking for alternative solutions to their problems because they felt like they were being ignored because they didn't see that, oh, well, if you know Spanish, you should learn English, so that's on you. That right there was already discrimination. Other people on the other hand said, well, he did his homework, why didn't you bring your homework? Without taking into account that maybe maybe he was couch surfing, maybe that student comes from a broken home, maybe there is some reason why he didn't sleep at home that night and he wasn't able to focus on doing her homework. There are a lot of factors that play in, and that's a reality which the urban schools face today, especially in Oakland, is that there are many disparities across the board. And because of those disparities, we try to approach it, regardless, I think, of your ethnicity, that everybody comes from the same playing field. And based on that, I think that's where discrimination comes foot. And a lot of people feel like they're marginalized instead on the sidelines for that very same reason. And as people become leadership, get in power, I feel like a lot of times that knowledge gets forgotten, or it gets mixed up or lost in the process when they're trying to get their own goals set up, and not realizing that the landscape has changed by the time they reached their leadership role.
Thank you. Could you describe some examples and sources of environmental racism in your district and say how they have affected OUSD students, parents, and educators? What commitments can you make toward combating the disproportionate impacts of pollutant exposure on OUSD students, parents, and educators?
Yeah, so when everybody comes out, I live on East Oakland, right? The flatland. So, I was one of those children in East Oakland that was rushed to Children's Hospital, I think when I was like 9 years old, because I was suffering from an asthma attack. Living in this environment is very triggering for my asthma, and it continues to be. I mean, that's the fact. There's a lot of pollutants. It's not fair for our children. It's not fair for the teachers that have to come to the flatlands and, and breathe that air for 50% of the time that, of the day that they're here. For me, it was constant because I lived here and I continue to live here. And, I lived and work. I work in downtown, but I come home here to East Oakland. We have to begin to hold the companies that are contaminating our community accountable for what they're doing. We also have to forest, our schools to plant more trees and to have plants inside our classrooms, so that if the air outside is contaminated, at least the air inside of the classroom is not. There are 50 plants that have been tested by NASA, that shows that if you have those plants inside a room, it clarifies and purifies the air. So we also need to not only do that in all the classroom, but also plant trees, like forest, make it a jungle pretty much, the schools of our children, so that we can be producing fresh air for the children, at least for the time that they're in the classroom, because eventually they're going to go back to their homes and the air is going to be contaminated. For me, that was one of the reasons why I sent my children to an elementary in the hills, and it's a public school, but the reason I did it is because at least 50% of the day I want them to breathe fresh air. And and then when they come here to the flatlands, at least my house, I have a lot of plants in my house, at least that can also help them continue to breathe better. So far my kids don't have asthma, and well, but it's not fair for the rest of us that are here. And in terms of also other pollutants, there's a lot of illegal dumping that happens here in the flatlands. Every day there is someone dumping. I mean, if you just come and just go outside my house, there's already, I could just show you, there's illegal dumping right now. So again, that creates rodents that get into your house, rats, roaches. I mean, we need to do much more advocacy for teachers and students and parents who are living in the flatlands.
Could you describe some examples and sources of environmental racism in your district and say how they have affected OUSD students, parents, and educators? It's a two-part question. The second question is, what commitments can you make toward combating the disproportionate impacts of pollutant exposure on OUSD students, parents, and educators?
Okay, so to describe it necessarily, I think one of the biggest, where it's most glaring, is seeing equity and educational access. And to break it down a little further, if we look at some of the hill schools as opposed to the flatland schools, when I was in Oakland, and that was for many, many years that I worked in Oakland, both as a teacher and an administrator, there were differences necessarily between the access that individuals had depending on where they lived or where they went to school. And I just kind of think it's important for the board members to understand that something has to be done to create equity among all students, regardless of that child, where that child lives or where that child goes to school. There has to be equity and uniformity, number one. And then you said the second question are the implications?
So the second question was, what commitments can you make toward combating the disproportionate impacts of pollutant exposure on OUSD students, parents, and educators?
Okay, let's see. When you speak of pollutant exposure, what exactly are you referring to?
So pollutants in the environment?
That's what I thought. Okay, that's a hard thing to deal with, because if you talk about where people live, it has been researched, and there is firm research data that actually say that many of the kids who live in West Oakland, in the West Oakland area, they're exposed to pollutants that adversely affect them. And I'm sure you know this because you're a teacher. Once your affective filter rises, it's almost impossible for learning to take place because you're concerned about whatever these things are. Like the cortisol might be released instead of the serotonin, and as a result of that, kids can't actually learn. Well, that I think is the direct relation to the pollutants. Is that time? Okay.